Imagine having an opening that you can play no matter what your opponent does. Sounds good, right? Well, that's exactly what the Pirc Defense offers. In this video, I'll show you the key ideas, typical plans, and how to crush your opponents with the Pirc Defense, whether they play aggressively or positionally. So let's begin. So playing with the black pieces, your opponent can start with anything. We are going to play the move d6, and then your opponent is simply going to play the move d4, e4, just taking control of the complete center. And now we are going to play the move knight to f6. A very important thing to notice, the Pirc Defense is an opening which is kind of similar to the King's Indian Defense or the Benoni Defense, which are kind of known for their aggressive style. So after knight to f6, we are kind of attacking the e4 pawn. So white have to develop the knight, which is the main move, just protecting the center pawn. And now we play the move g6. And after g6, from here, there are multiple ways for white to continue the possession. White can play the move knight to f3, white can play the move f4, white can play the move bishop e3, and even bishop g5. First, quickly checking the move knight to f3, which is the main move, just developing both the knights. We develop the bishop, white can develop bishop, castle, castle, and now we have the move c6. c6 is a main move which depicts the Pirc Defense opening. So after c6, white simply plays the move bishop e3, which is the main move. White can even go for playing the move a4 or bishop e3. It doesn't really matter because our idea still remains the same. We are having generally two options. After a4, we can play the move a5, which is absolutely fine move because after a4, our opponent wants to grab space with a5. So we simply stop it by playing the move a5 by ourselves. And now, for example, h3, taking control of the g4 square from the bishop, we can simply develop the knight to d7, bishop to e3, and now e5. Once again, e5 is a move which is a typical idea in such Pirc Defense opening, because after e5, like your main idea is just to develop your pieces and nothing else. You are not really aiming to take on d4, you just want to allow your opponent to take on e5, because after e5, if your opponent takes it back, you simply take it back with the pawn. And after, for example, if queen e2, just queen e7. If it's just rook d1, trying to get all the pieces, you can play the move knight to c5. What is the idea? Currently, you are attacking the pawn on e4. Your opponent can defend it with bishop d3. You can first remove the bishop. Now, first of all, you are having the bishop pair. And now, I want to play the move bishop e6, but the moment I play bishop e6, the opponent can simply capture the pawn on e5. So first, I'm going to play the move knight to h5. First, allowing the bishop to protect the pawn, and now our idea is to simply play the move bishop e6. And another idea could be to play knight to f4, because if it takes with the bishop, the bishop on g7 simply opens up, and that position is already pretty great. So that's exactly what happens if we can play the move a5. That's absolutely fine position. You can also play the move bishop g4, simply focusing on developing your pieces. If bishop e3, just develop your knight, queen d2, queen c7, with the ideas like a5, e5, rook e8. Like your main idea is to play the move e5, striking in the center, and just play rook e8, a5, not allowing your opponent to grab more space on the queen side, and that's the perfect position to play with the black pieces. You're having absolutely no problem. Now coming to the second variation, which is to play the move f4, which is also known as the Austrian attack, we are going to play the move bishop to g7. What is the idea of f4? Basically, after f4, now white can play the move knight f3, castle up, and now a main idea could be to play the move e5. At the first glance, it looks like a very tempting option, because with the help of the f4 pawn, definitely white can push the pawn to e5. We can simply capture up the pawn, and now white is really having two options to capture with the d or the f pawn. First, starting with the d pawn, we can simply trade out the queen, king takes, and now simply knight h5. It looks like the bishop on g7 is bad piece. White is having more space in the center. Well, yeah, that's true. But after knight h5, if you try to think with a calm mind, you will notice white is having a weakness on f4. So our idea is to somehow remove this pawn from the f4 square, so that immediately we can simply capture the e5 pawn. So after knight h5, we are putting pressure on the f4 pawn. For example, if white simply develops the bishop, we pin up the knight on f3, and now after rook f1, you see the knight is pinned. So now we can play the move g5. This is a typical idea in such positions, because the knight cannot really capture the pawn because the knight is pinned. And now we are just looking forward to capture the pawn on f4. So I'd have to capture it back, and now finally you will realize now the e5 pawn is weak. We can simply capture the pawn on e5 with the bishop, and now the bishop on e5 is a very strong piece. And white is having double pawns on the g files. I believe it's a completely fine position to play with the black pieces. Your idea could be to simply play the move knight to c6, get your rooks into the game, and black is absolutely fine. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent takes with the d pawn. If he takes with the f pawn, which looks like the main move, you see white has kind of overextended in the center, which allows us to put our knight to d5, which is the main square for the knight. And after bishop c4, something like double attacking the knight on d5. Now there are multiple options. The option that I personally like is to play the move knight to b6, simply attacking the bishop. The bishop goes back, and now simply c5. Once again, the center pawns are overextended. We want to capture the pawn on e5. So first we have to remove the pawn on d4. How can we do so? By simply playing the move c5. And now our threat is to simply capture the pawn. So white is not really having much but to capture the pawn. It looks like a free pawn, but we can trade off the queen, knight cross, and now knight to d7. We are attacking both the pawns. One pawn is going to fall. White can play the move e6, trying to hold on to the pawn by attacking the knight and the pawn. We can simply capture the pawn on c5 now. He can capture on f7, we can move the king, and now it looks like white is having a very strong pawn on f7. But guys, we are going to play the move bishop e6 on the next move. White can't really stop it. For example, bishop c4, because currently our idea is just simply capture the bishop and then capture the pawn. So first you have to move the bishop, and now simply bishop e6, forcing off a bishop trade, and now we can simply capture the pawn on f7 as well. Material wise we are even. For example, if c3, knight c6, and now here is our idea. We want to simply expand on the queen side with a5, b5, b4, opening up this dark square bishop, and I believe black is having an absolutely fine position with absolutely no problem. So that's exactly what you can play if your opponent tries to play the move e5. If your opponent plays something like bishop to d3, simply focusing on developing the pieces, just knight c6, castle up, and e5. He can take on e5, take, and now there are mainly two options. For example, if he becomes a bit greedy and try to go for capturing another pawn with the pawn, we can simply capture the pawn on e5. Why? Because we are giving up the free knight, but it allows us to play the move queen to d4 check. It's a check, and on the next move we are simply going to capture the knight, and guess what? Now we are the one a pawn up, and that's the absolutely fine position. We are not kind of pawn up, but the e4 pawn is absolutely weak. His king is much weak, and black is having absolutely no problem, and black is already better. So that's exactly what happens if white takes on e5. If he pushes the pawn to d5, attacking the knight on c6, now we can simply jump in with the knight to d4. If he becomes a bit greedy and try to capture the e5 pawn, we can simply play the move knight cross e4. And now what is the idea? We are just opening up the bishop on g7 to capture the knight on e5. So after a couple of trade, for example, if bishop e3, simply attacking the knight on d4, just pull it back to f5 square. Attacking the bishop on e3, he might capture, bishop takes, and now you are the one having the bishop pair. You can pull your bishop back to g7, put your queen to d7, get your another rook to d8, attack the pawn on c5, and believe me, I'm already favoring black in this position, and black is undoubtedly better in this position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays the move f4, the Austrian attack. Now coming to some basic sideline, which is bishop e3 or bishop to g5. Starting with bishop e3, which is like kind of the main move nowadays, because after bishop g7, queen d2, white's idea is to castle up long and attack on the king side with f3, g4, h4, h5, and it looks like a very crazy attack. Definitely we are going to castle up, allowing the opponent to long castle, and now we are going to play the main move, the c6, the Pirc defense. Opponent is looking forward to playing the move f3, trying to expand his pawns on the king side, attacking the black king. Our idea is still the same. We want to expand on the queen side and attack the opponent's king. So we are going to play the move b5, g4, queen to a5. What's our idea? Queen a5, our idea is typically to play the move b4, removing the knight from the c3 square, and then simply capturing the pawn on a2. And that makes sense. So white is like, okay, let me play the move king b1, just protecting the pawn on a2 with the king, which is the best move. And now it's time for us to develop our another piece with bishop to e6. Once again, our idea is to play the move b4, as we have got our one piece extra to attack the pawn on a2. So white is like, okay, now let me play the move b3, trying to restrict the bishop from taking on a2. And now we can just push the pawn to b4, kicking this knight away. And now what's our idea? After b4, you will realize now white is having weaknesses like the a3 and the c3 square. So we want to put this knight on the a3 or the c3 square. But how to do so is the question. Our idea is to play the move knight a6, knight c7, knight b4, knight b5, and just put the knight to maybe c3 or a3. Mostly, I believe c3 is the main square. So starting with knight a6, h4, knight c7, h5, knight b5. We're kind of ignoring the threat of white. If it takes on g6, we can happily take with the f pawn. Generally, in typical positions, we take with the h pawn, but I believe if we take with the h pawn in this particular position, it not only opens up our rook, but it also makes the square for the king to run away, maybe on the queen side on the couple of moves. So after bishop h6, queen to a3. What is the idea? We are taking away squares from the white king, and now at the right time, we are going to play the move knight to c3 check. And after takes check, we are threatening a mate on b2. So for example, if you have a trade of the bishop, he can give a check and he can push the pawn to e5. First of all, g5 would be a big blunder because after knight c3 check, takes, the queen can't really go back to c1, and it's a force mate on b2. So going back, that's why e5 makes a bit more sense, still making a square for the queen to go back. We can trade off the pawns, and now rook to d8, getting the rook, threatening mate in 1. So the rook has to move, because if it takes, we can happily trade up with the once again with the threat of rook d1, which is completely winning for us. So rook e1, now knight to d5, allowing the opponent to take on h7, just moving the king, just pulling the bishop back. And believe me, like, white can give a couple of checks if white wants, but after king c7, white is not really having any checks available, and now knight c3 is kind of an unstoppable move, so it doesn't matter whatever the opponent plays, it's a check. The opponent have to move, and now it's a mate on a2. So that's exactly what you can play if your opponent plays the move bishop e3. Basically it's a very detailed explanation about this particular variation. Now coming to the main variation is bishop to g5, which is absolutely sideline, not at all a good sideline. Bishop g7, queen e2 with the same idea. h6 we can play in this particular position, attacking the bishop. If bishop takes the knight, we're absolutely happy with e cross f6, and now our king side is absolutely well protected and we are having no troubles. Bishop can go back, which is the main move, and now g5. Bishop goes to g3, knight goes to h5. We are going to take the bishop on g3, develop our knight to c6. What is the idea, you would ask? Because if we try to castle on the king side now, we have already a bit over extended on the king side, so it's not a good idea typically to castle upon the king side. So after knight c6, our idea is generally to play the move a6. We want to play the move b5, and now rook to b8, and now e6. A typical idea of e6 is to just basically our idea of e6 here is like we are telling to our opponent that we want to keep our king in the center, because if we try to go for because the king is much betterly placed in the center compared to the king side or the queen side. So e6 kind of we're kind of getting defensive in the center. And now our idea after something like f3 is to just play bishop d7, queen e7, developing all our pieces. And now with the idea of a5, b4, and maybe at the right time we can even go d5, opening up the queen from the e7 square. And that makes a lot of sense, and yeah, that's exactly how you can play the Pirc defense. So yeah, with this, I believe I have given you a basic idea about how to play the Pirc defense. If you really want to master this particular opening, try to watch as many games as possible of top players, and you would eventually get an idea about this, how to play this Pirc defense, and try to play as many games as possible in this particular opening to get a bit more experience, because this opening requires experience. So try to play as many games as possible, try to watch as many games as possible, because that will help you to gain experience and try to understand this opening much better. And yeah, that's the opening you can play with the black pieces no matter what your opponent plays, because your ideas are kind of the same. So yeah, I hope that this video was helpful. If you learned something new today, make sure to like, share and subscribe, and I'm going to come up with these more exciting videos like this. So till then, stay tuned and keep watching Oneshot Chess. Bye bye.